Most people think genius only exists in Ivy League lecture halls or Silicon Valley boardrooms. But what happened on the 47th floor of quantum dynamics headquarters at Tuesday night in March would shatter every assumption about where brilliance actually hides and who gets to claim it. Marcus Chen, the 38-year-old founder and CEO of Quantum Dynamics, one of the fastest-growing artificial intelligence companies in the world, had built his entire empire on identifying talent that others overlooked. His company had revolutionized machine learning algorithms, created AI systems that predicted market trends with 94% accuracy, and developed natural language processing tools that made previous technology look like cave drawings. Marcus himself had dropped out of MIT after 2 semesters, not because he was failing but because the curriculum moved too slowly for his restless, pattern-seeking mind. He'd made his first million by 23, his first billion by 32, and now commanded a company valued at $18 billion, with offices in 7 countries and over 3,000 employees. But despite all his success in building systems to recognize patterns and predict outcomes, Marcus was about to encounter a pattern he'd never anticipated, a variable that would completely upend his understanding of intelligence, opportunity, and what it means to see potential in someone the entire world had trained itself to ignore. The evening started like most evenings for Marcus, which meant it started with controlled chaos and ended somewhere between exhaustion and exhilaration. He'd spent the day in back-to-back meetings with venture capitalists who wanted to invest another $100 million into quantum dynamics, engineers who discovered a breakthrough in quantum computing integration that could accelerate their processing speeds by a factor of 12. And lawyers who were navigating a patent dispute with a competitor who'd allegedly stolen proprietary code. His calendar was color-coded by his assistant into categories ranging from critical to moderately important, and there was virtually no white space between the blocks. Lunch had been a protein shake consumed during a conference call with the Tokyo office, and dinner would probably be whatever the building's cafe had left over after the evening shift. Marcus lived on the top floor of the Quantum Dynamics Tower in a penthouse that doubled as his residence, a setup that blurred the line between work and life so completely that the distinction had become meaningless years ago. His ex-wife had left him 18 months earlier, citing his marriage to the company as irreconcilable grounds for divorce, and while Marcus had felt genuine sadness about the separation, he'd also felt a strange sense of relief that he no longer had to pretend he could compartmentalize his obsession with building something that would outlast him. On this particular Tuesday, Marcus had stayed later than usual because his 12-year-old son, Adrian, was visiting for his weekly overnight stay, a court-mandated arrangement that Marcus actually cherished despite the disruption to his work schedule. Adrian was a quiet, serious child who'd inherited his father's analytical mind but seemed to possess an emotional intelligence that Marcus had never quite mastered. The boy would sit in Marcus's office doing homework while his father worked, occasionally asking questions that revealed a depth of thinking that startled Marcus every single time. Adrian didn't just want to know how things worked. He wanted to know why they worked that way and whether they could work better. Tonight, Adrian had finished his algebra homework in 20 minutes, a set of problems that should have taken an hour, and then pulled out a laptop that Marcus had given him on his birthday. The laptop wasn't some toy computer with parental controls and limited functionality. It was a professional-grade machine with the same operating system and development tools that quantum dynamics engineers used. Marcus believed in giving children real tools and real challenges, and Adrian had taken to programming with the same natural fluency that some kids showed for music or athletics. Around 9:30 in the evening, after Adrian had been quietly typing and clicking for over 2 hours, Marcus finally pushed back from his desk and walked over to see what his son was working on. The boy had a habit of diving deep into projects without announcing what he was doing, and Marcus found these discoveries to be one of the few genuine surprises left in his algorithmically optimized life. When Marcus looked over Adrian's shoulder at the laptop screen, he expected to see a simple game or perhaps a basic website, the kind of projects that middle school kids typically attempted. Instead, what he saw made him pause and lean closer, his eyes narrowing as he traced the lines of code flowing down the screen. Adrian was working on a recursive function in Python, but it wasn't a textbook example or a copied tutorial. The logic was elegant and efficient, using a technique called memoization that most programmers didn't encounter until college-level computer science courses. The program appeared to be calculating optimal pathways through a network, something that had practical applications in everything from logistics to neural network architecture. Marcus felt a surge of pride mixed with curiosity, and he asked Adrian where he'd learned the technique. The beau's answer was what would change everything. Adrian turned in his chair, his serious dark eyes meeting his father's, and said simply that Clara had shown him. Clara had explained how to store previously computed results to avoid redundant calculations. Clara had walked him through the logic step by step until it made perfect sense. Clara had told him that the best programmers weren't the ones who memorized the most commands, but the ones who understood the underlying patterns. Marcus stood completely still for a moment, processing this information with the same intensity he applied to merger negotiations or strategic planning sessions. Clara, he knew exactly who Adrian meant. Clara Reyes was the night shift security guard who worked the executive floors of the Quantum Dynamics building. She was a woman in her late 30s who Marcus had seen hundreds of times over the past 3 years but had never really noticed in any meaningful way. She wore the standard security uniform, a navy blue shirt with the Quantum Dynamics logo embroidered on the chest, tan matching pants, with a utility belt that held a flashlight, radio, and keys. She sat at the security desk in the lobby of the 47th floor, checking identification badges, monitoring security cameras, and making rounds through the offices every hour to ensure everything was locked and secure. Marcus had nodded at her countless times, had signed in and out of the building under her watchful eye, had even had brief exchanges about weather or building maintenance, but he'd never once considered her as anything more than part of the building's infrastructure. She was furniture with a pulse, a necessary function that required a human presence, but didn't demand human engagement. The idea that this woman, this security guard who sat at a desk and watched screens, had been teaching his son advanced programming concepts was so unexpected that Marcus felt momentarily disoriented, as if he'd walked into a room and found gravity working sideways. He asked Adrian how this had come about, trying to keep his tone casual even though his mind was racing through implications and possibilities. Adrian explained that he'd been working in the office on previous Tuesday visits, and Clara would sometimes walk by during her rounds. She'd noticed what he was doing and had asked if she could take a look. At first, Adrian admitted, he'd been a little defensive because he thought she was going to tell him he shouldn't be on the computer so late or lecture him about screen time like his mother did. But instead, Clara had pulled up a chair and started asking him questions about what he was trying to accomplish. She didn't talk down to him or oversimplify things. She spoke to him like a colleague, another programmer working through a problem. When Adrian got stuck on implementing a sorting algorithm, Clara had shown him 3 different approaches, explained the time complexity of each one, and helped him understand when to use which method. She'd told him about big O notation and how to think about efficiency at scale. She'd introduced him to concepts like recursion, iteration, and dynamic programming. And she'd done all of this during her breaks, in the 10 or 15-minute windows, and she could step away from the security desk, treating each interaction like a mini-lecture at a university that existed only in the fluorescent-lit hallways after the official workday ended. Marcus felt something unusual stirring in his chest, an emotion he couldn't immediately categorize. It wasn't anger or suspicion, though part of him wondered why a security guard would have this knowledge in the first place. It wasn't concern for his son's safety, because Adrian clearly respected and trusted Clara. What Marcus felt was something closer to fascination mixed with the uncomfortable realization that he'd been walking past someone with significant technical knowledge for 3 years without ever suspecting it. He prided himself on identifying talent, on seeing potential in unconventional places, and yet here was someone who'd been hiding in plain sight, disguised by a uniform and a job title that society had collectively decided didn't require intelligence. Marcus looked at the code on Adrian's screen again, then at his son's face, which was glowing with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found a teacher who made difficult concepts feel accessible. He made a decision in that moment, the kind of instinctive choice that had guided his most successful business moves. He told Adrian to save his work, and together they would go find Clara and thank her properly. What Marcus really wanted was to understand who this woman was and what she was doing working security when she clearly had skills that could command six-figure salaries in the tech industry. They found Clara at her desk in the executive lobby, sitting in front of a bank of monitors showing various camera feeds from around the building. She was reading a book, which she placed face down on the desk when she saw Marcus and Adrian approaching. Marcus noticed the title as she set it down. Introduction to Quantum Computing, Theory and Applications. It was a graduate-level textbook that even some of his engineers struggled with. Clara stood up as they approached, a professional smile on her face that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was slightly taller than average, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of neutral expression that people develop when they work jobs where they're supposed to be present but invisible. Marcus noticed she had small scars on her hands, the kind that came from manual labor or repetitive physical work. She greeted them both politely, addressing Marcus as Mr. Chen and Adrian by his first name. And there was a warmth in her voice when she spoke to the boy that made Marcus realize they developed a genuine rapport. He wondered how many other Tuesday nights Adrian had spent learning from this woman while Marcus was buried in spreadsheets 3 doors away. Marcus introduced himself properly, which felt absurd given that his name was on the building and his face was on the company website, but he wanted to start this conversation on equal footing. He told Clara that Adrian had been showing him some of the programming concepts she'd taught him, and he was genuinely impressed by both the sophistication of the material and the clarity of her instruction. He watched her face carefully as he spoke, looking for tells that might reveal something about her background or motivations. What he saw surprised him. Clara didn't preen or puff up with pride at the compliment. She didn't deflect or minimize her contribution. Instead, she looked directly at Marcus with eyes that were sharp and evaluating, as if she were assessing whether he was genuinely interested or just being polite. After a moment, she thanked him simply and said that Adrian was a gifted student who made teaching easy. She added that it was rare to find a young person so genuinely curious about understanding the why behind the how, and that kind of thinking would take him far regardless of what field he chose. The way she spoke revealed education and articulation that seemed inconsistent with her current position, and Marcus found himself more intrigued with every passing second. He asked her directly, keeping his tone conversational but unable to completely mask his curiosity, where she'd learned to code. The question hung in the air for a moment, and Marcus saw something shift in Clara's expression, a quick flash of something that might have been pain or resignation before the professional mask settled back into place. She told him she'd studied computer science and mathematics at Berkeley, finishing her undergraduate degree and completing 2 years of a PhD program before circumstances changed and she had to leave. The words were delivered matter-of-factly, without self-pity or elaboration, but Marcus heard volumes in what she didn't say. Berkeley's computer science program was consistently ranked in the top 3 in the world. Getting into their PhD program meant Clara had been recognized as exceptional among exceptional candidates. Leaving that program meant something significant had happened, something that had derailed a trajectory that should have led to a career at places like Google, Facebook, or Quantum Dynamics, not to a night shift security job where her education was completely wasted on checking ID badges and watching camera feeds. Marcus wanted to ask what had happened. What circumstances could possibly have been compelling enough to pull someone away from that path, but he'd built enough companies and managed enough people to recognize when someone had boundaries they weren't ready to cross. Instead, he shifted his approach and asked if she still kept up with the field. Clara's response was immediate and unguarded, revealing genuine passion that broke through her professional reserve. She told him she did, voraciously. She read research papers during her shifts, followed developments in machine learning and quantum computing, participated in online programming communities under a pseudonym, and worked through problem sets and coding challenges to keep her skills sharp. She described it as intellectual survival, the only way to keep her mind from atrophying in a job that required alertness, but not actual thinking. She spoke faster as she continued, her hands moving in small gestures that suggested she didn't often get to talk about these things with someone who understood. She mentioned a recent breakthrough in transformer architecture that had improved language model efficiency by 30%, and she questioned whether the approach would scale or if it was an optimization that only worked at specific model sizes. Marcus realized with something approaching shock that Clara wasn't just keeping up with the field. She was at the cutting edge of current research, the kind of knowledge that his own machine learning team would have been discussing in their meetings. Adrian was watching both of them with quiet attention, and Marcus saw his son smile slightly, as if he'd known his father would be impressed and was pleased to have orchestrated this revelation. The boy had set them up, Marcus realized, not with any malicious intent but with the innocent belief that bringing two people together who shared a passion would result in something good. Marcus looked at Clara with new eyes, seeing past the uniform and the job title to recognize someone whose intellectual firepower might match or exceed many of the people on his payroll. He made another instinctive decision, the kind of impulse that is bored of. Directors sometimes question but that had resulted in some of his most successful hires. He asked Clara if she would be willing to come to his office for a proper conversation when her shift ended at 6 in the morning. He told her honestly that he was interested in understanding her background and exploring whether there might be a role at Quantum Dynamics that would better utilize her skills. He watched her face carefully for her reaction, and what he saw was a complex mixture of hope, skepticism, and something that looked like exhaustion, as if she'd been down this road before and it had led nowhere. Clara took a long moment before responding, and when she did, her voice had a quality of careful neutrality that Marcus recognized as self-protection. She told him she'd be willing to talk, but she wanted to be clear about something first. She didn't need charity or pity. She didn't want to be anyone's feel-good diversity hire or human interest story. If he was interested in her skills, that was one thing, but if this was about assuaging some guilt about class or opportunity, she'd rather they end the conversation now. Her directness should have been off-putting, but Marcus found it refreshing. He spent most of his time with people who carefully managed their words around him, who pitched their ideas and themselves with practiced polish that obscured genuine communication. Clara was treating him like an equal, pushing back with the confidence of someone who knew her own worth even if the world had failed to recognize it. Marcus told her he didn't do pity hires and his company couldn't afford to employ anyone who didn't add real value. If she was as good as Adrian's code suggested and her conversation indicated, then she was exactly the kind of person he wanted at Quantum Dynamics. If it turned out she wasn't, then they'd both know quickly and could part ways professionally. Clara studied his face for a moment, then nodded and agreed to meet him at 6:15. In his office, the rest of Clara's shift passed in a blur of standard duties and racing thoughts. She made her rounds through the executive floors, checking that conference room doors were locked and that no one had left confidential documents on desks. She monitored the security feeds, watching night cleaning crews move through lower floors and late-working engineers hunched over keyboards in the development department. She responded to a minor issue on the 32nd floor where someone had propped open a fire door, triggering an alert that she had to verify and reset. She did all of these things automatically, her body moving through practiced routines while her mind spun through possibilities and probabilities, hope and cynicism battling for dominance in her thoughts. Clara had learned over the past 6 years to keep her expectations low and her guard high. She'd learned that the world was full of people who were fascinated by her story right up until the moment when helping her became inconvenient or complicated. She'd been told she was impressive and talented and full of potential by people who never followed through with anything concrete. She'd watched opportunities dissolve like morning fog when the details of her situation came to light. So even though Marcus Chen seemed genuinely interested, even though he'd built a reputation as someone who took unconventional risks on unconventional people, Clara forced herself to remain skeptical. Hope was a luxury she could no longer afford in the quantities she'd once possessed. But despite her careful emotional management, Clara couldn't completely suppress the small flame of possibility that Marcus's invitation had ignited. She thought about what it would mean to work at a company like Quantum Dynamics, to be surrounded by people who spoke her language and understood the problems that kept her awake at night. She thought about contributing to projects that mattered, that pushed the boundaries of what was possible rather than simply maintaining the boundaries of what existed. She thought about using her mind for something more than memorizing security protocols and writing incident reports. The job she currently held was necessary and she performed it well, but it used approximately 3% of her intellectual capacity on a generous day. The remaining 97% she poured into late-night reading, online courses she couldn't afford to get credit for, and the occasional tutoring session with bright kids like Adrian, who somehow found their way into her orbit. It was a half-life, an existence that paid her bills and kept her son fed but left her feeling like she was slowly disappearing, becoming invisible even to herself. When her replacement arrived at 6 in the morning, a cheerful older man named Raymond who worked a day shift, Clara logged off the security system and gathered her things with unusual nervousness. She changed out of her uniform in the women's locker room in the basement, putting on jeans and a simple blouse that were clean, but obviously inexpensive. She didn't own anything she would call professional clothes anymore, having sold most of her better pieces years ago, when money was particularly tight. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a woman who looked older than her 38 years, lines around her eyes from night shift work and stress, gray hair she didn't bother to color because who was she trying to impress? While checking security badges, she pulled her hair out of its ponytail and let it fall around her shoulders, then immediately pulled it back up again, frustrated with herself for caring about appearance when this was supposed to be about capability. But she knew that appearance mattered, that people made judgments in the first 7 seconds of interaction that no amount of subsequent demonstration could fully overcome. She was walking into Marcus Chen's office as a security guard, and that label came with a set of assumptions she would have to actively combat. Clara took the elevator out to the 47th floor and walked toward Marcus's office with her shoulders back and her chin up, projecting a confidence she didn't entirely feel. She'd been on this floor hundreds of times, but always as staff, always as someone whose presence was functional rather than valued. Now she was walking these halls, something potentially different, and the shift in perspective was disorienting. She found Marcus in his office, still working despite the fact that he'd probably been awake for 24 hours. Adrian was asleep on a leather couch in the corner, covered with a blanket, his laptop still glowing on the coffee table beside him. Marcus looked up when Clara knocked on the open door, and he waved her in with a smile that looked genuine rather than practiced. He'd ordered coffee from somewhere, and he poured her a cup without asking, sliding it across his desk along with cream and sugar. The gesture was small, but it registered with Clara as intentional. He was trying to put her at ease. Marcus started the conversation by asking Clara to tell him her story, the full version without the careful editing she'd given him earlier. He told her honestly that he needed context to understand how someone with her background ended up working building security, and that he couldn't properly evaluate how to move forward without understanding what he was working with. His directness matched her own, and Clara appreciated not having to navigate social niceties or coded language. She took a breath and began talking, and once she started, the words came faster than she'd intended, 6 years of compressed narrative spilling out in a rush of explanation and defended choices. She told him about Barclay, about being one of the few women in her PhD program, and certainly one of the few women of color. She talked about her research focus on algorithmic bias in machine learning systems, work that was beginning to gain attention just as the field was waking up to the implications of training AI on biased datasets. She described the excitement of being at the cutting edge of something important, of doing work that could actually make technology more equitable and less likely to perpetuate historical discrimination. Then Clara's narrative shifted, and Marcus heard the exact moment when everything changed. She told him about meeting her ex-husband, about a whirlwind relationship that led to marriage and then quickly to pregnancy. She'd been in her 3rd year of the PhD program when she got pregnant, and she'd naively believed she could manage both motherhood and academic research. The university had said all the right things about supporting student parents, but the reality had been different from the policy. When her daughter was born premature at 30 weeks, requiring 2 months in the NICU and ongoing medical intervention for respiratory issues, Clara had tried to take a medical leave while maintaining her research. But her advisor, a brilliant professor who had never had to balance childcare with academia, had made it increasingly clear that her commitment was being questioned. Deadlines that were flexible for other students became rigid for her. Meetings were scheduled at times that conflicted with her daughter's medical appointments. Comments were made about dedication and sacrifice and how serious researchers prioritize their work above all else. Clara's voice became flatter as she continued. The emotion leached out as a protective measure against the pain these memories still carried. She explained that her marriage had deteriorated under the stress of a sick infant and financial pressure. Her husband unable to cope with the medical bills and the constant crisis management their life had become. He'd left when their daughter was 8 months old, and Clara had found herself suddenly single, drowning in medical debt, and trying to complete a PhD program that was actively hostile to her circumstances. She'd pushed on for another year, working through the night after her daughter finally fell asleep, surviving on maybe 3 hours of rest, watching her research suffer because she simply didn't have enough hours or enough energy to do everything. Eventually, her advisor had told her plainly that she needed to either commit fully to the program or step aside for someone who would. The subtext was clear. Choosing her daughter was choosing failure, so Clara had made the choice that wasn't really a choice at all. She'd withdrawn from the PhD program, taken her master's degree as a consolation prize, and entered a job market that was far less interested in an incomplete doctorate than in fresh graduates who could work 80-hour weeks without complications. The job search had been brutal and Clara's voice carried traces of bitterness. She described it to Marcus. She'd applied to hundreds of positions, from senior engineering roles to junior developer jobs. She'd been called for interviews, had performed well in technical screenings, had made it to final rounds several times. But then would come the inevitable questions about her employment gap, about why she'd left Berkeley, about her child care arrangements. Companies that claimed to value diversity and work-life balance suddenly became concerned about her commitment and availability. One interviewer had told her directly that they needed someone who could be flexible with hours, the implication being that a single mother couldn't possibly fit that description. Another had asked during an interview whether she planned to have more children, a question that was literally illegal, but impossible to challenge without burning a bridge she might need to cross. Offer after offer went to someone else, usually someone younger and male and unencumbered by dependence or debt. Clara had watched her savings evaporate, had sold everything that wasn't essential, had moved into progressively smaller and cheaper apartments in worse neighborhoods. Her daughter's medical needs continued, requiring specialists and medications that her increasingly inadequate health insurance barely covered. She'd taken contract work when she could find it, building websites for small businesses and doing data analysis for companies that didn't care about her credentials as long as the work was cheap. But contract work was unpredictable and the rates were a fraction of what she would have earned in a permanent position. Eventually, Clara continued, she'd needed something stable and immediate. The security job at Quantum Dynamics had come through an employment agency that specialized in placing people who needed work immediately and couldn't afford to be choosy. The pay was barely above minimum wage, but it was consistent, and crucially, it came with health insurance that covered her daughter's pre-existing conditions. The night shift paid a small premium and allowed her to be home during the day when her daughter was at school and in the evening until bedtime. It wasn't the life she'd planned or the career she'd trained for, but it was survival, and survival was something Clara had become grimly proficient at. She told Marcus that she'd been working security for 3 years, watching an industry she'd once been part of from the outside, reading about breakthroughs and innovations that she could have contributed to if circumstances had been different. She described the particular torture of walking through offices full of engineers solving interesting problems, of overhearing technical discussions in elevators and hallways, of feeling her skills atrophy even as she desperately tried to maintain them through self-study. She admitted that teaching Adrian had been the first time in years she'd felt like her knowledge had value, like she was something more than a uniformed observer of other people's meaningful work. When Clara finished talking, there was silence in the office, broken only by Adrian's quiet breathing from the couch. Marcus sat back in his chair and processed what he'd heard, and Clara watched his face for signs of pity or dismissal or the polite disengagement that usually followed these revelations. But what she saw instead was something more analytical, as if Marcus were working through a complex problem and evaluating possible solutions. After a long moment, he spoke, and his first question surprised her. He asked if she would be willing to take a technical assessment, a real one, not some simplified coding challenge, but the same evaluation they gave to senior engineering candidates. Clara felt her pulse quicken and she asked why. Marcus's answer was characteristically direct. He told her that everything she'd said was compelling and her credentials were impressive, but he needed objective proof of her current capability. Years away from active development could dull even the sharpest skills, and he had to know whether she could actually perform at the level his company required. If she could pass the assessment, they would talk seriously about positions. If she couldn't, they would part ways and at least she'd have closure. The bluntness should have stung, but Clara found it liberating. This was evaluation based on merit, on what she could do rather than who she was or what her circumstances had been. She agreed immediately, and Marcus pulled up the assessment on his computer and sent her the link. He told her she could take it now if she wanted, or schedule it for another time, whatever worked for her. Clara looked at the clock and saw it was nearly 7 in the morning. She'd been awake for over 24 hours and was running on adrenaline and coffee. The smart move would be to go home, rest, and take the assessment when she was fresh. But Clara had spent 6 years making smart moves that kept her safe and stuck, and something about this moment felt different, felt like the kind of opportunity that wouldn't wait for optimal conditions. She told Marcus she'd take it now. He nodded as if he'd expected that answer, then stood and told her she could use one of the conference rooms where she wouldn't be disturbed. He'd give her 4 hours for an assessment that typically took 3, and she should reach out if she needed anything. As Clara followed him to the conference room, laptop in hand and heart pounding, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. The belief that maybe, possibly, things could actually change. The technical assessment was everything Marcus had promised it would be: comprehensive, challenging, and entirely focused on demonstrating actual capability. Clara worked through algorithm design problems that required not just coding but mathematical proof of efficiency. She built a small machine learning model from scratch, training it on a sample dataset and optimizing its performance. She debugged deliberately broken code that contained subtle errors requiring deep understanding of how different systems interacted. She designed a database schema for a hypothetical application and wrote queries that would retrieve information efficiently at scale. She answered theoretical questions about system architecture, explaining how she would design infrastructure for millions of concurrent users and what trade-offs she would make between consistency and availability. The problems were intricate and interconnected, each one building on knowledge from previous sections, and Clara lost herself in the work completely. This was the first time in 3 years she'd been genuinely challenged intellectually, the first time her brain had been allowed to run at full capacity, and it felt extraordinary. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, muscle memory combining with deep knowledge to produce solutions that were elegant and efficient. She caught herself smiling as she worked through a particularly clever problem involving graph traversal, the kind of smile that came from pure intellectual pleasure. 3 hours and 40 minutes after she started, Clara submitted the assessment and walked back to Marcus's office on unsteady legs. The adrenaline was wearing off and exhaustion was crashing over her in waves, but she felt more alive than she had in years. Marcus was still at his desk, still working, and Adrian had woken up and was eating breakfast that had been delivered from somewhere. The beau waved at Clara cheerfully and she waved back, grateful for his presence as a reminder that this surreal morning was actually happening. Marcus asked her to wait while he reviewed her submission, and Clara sat in one of the leather chairs facing his desk, trying not to watch his face too obviously as his eyes scanned her code and solutions. She knew she'd done well, could feel it in the same way she used to feel when she'd nailed a presentation or written a particularly strong paper, but knowing it and having it validated were different things, and the minutes stretched out interminably as Marcus read through her work with focused intensity. Finally, Marcus looked up from his computer and his expression was unreadable for just a moment before it shifted into something that might have been respect. He told Clara that her assessment results were in the 97th percentile compared to all senior engineer candidates they'd tested in the past 2 years. Her algorithm implementations were clean and efficient. Her system design showed sophisticated understanding of scale and reliability, and her machine learning model had actually outperformed the benchmark solution his team had created. He said that based on this assessment alone, he would hire her for a senior engineering role without hesitation. Then he paused and added that he thought she was capable of more than that. He asked if she would be interested in a technical leadership position, something that would involve not just engineering but strategic thinking about where the company should invest its research and development resources. The role would come with a salary in the mid-200s, full benefits, equity in the company, and the expectation that she would push back against him and the rest of leadership when she disagreed with their direction. Marcus told her he'd built quantum dynamics by surrounding himself with people who were smarter than him in specific domains, and he believed Clara could be one of those people if she wanted the challenge. Clara sat very still, processing words that seemed impossible even as they were being spoken. A technical leadership role, mid-$200,000 salary, benefits and equity. The ability to actually influence direction at a company that was doing meaningful work at the cutting edge of AI development. It was everything she'd dreamed about during those late nights in graduate school, the kind of position that would have been her expected trajectory if her life hadn't derailed, and yet hearing it offered now, after everything she'd been through, felt almost cruel in its improbability. She found herself unable to speak for a moment, emotion clogging her throat in a way that embarrassed her. She was not someone who had trained herself out of that vulnerability years ago, but she could feel tears threatening and had to blink hard to keep them from falling. Marcus seemed to understand that she needed a moment, and he turned to Adrian and started discussing the woes plans for the rest of the week, giving Clara space to compose herself. When Clara could trust her voice, she asked Marcus if he was serious, and she heard how the question revealed her disbelief. Marcus looked at her directly and told her he'd never been more serious about a hiring decision. He explained his reasoning with the kind of transparency she was coming to recognize as characteristic. He said that Quantum Dynamics was at an inflection point as a company. They were growing fast, maybe too fast, and they needed people who could think strategically about where to focus resources and how to build systems that wouldn't break as they scaled. More importantly, they needed people who understood that the technology they were building had real implications for real people. Clara's research background in algorithmic bias was actually something he'd been trying to recruit for, and finding someone with both the technical depth and the lived experience to think about equity in AI systems was exactly what his leadership team was missing. He admitted that he hadn't expected to find that person working security in his own building, but sometimes the best opportunities came from unpredictable directions. He told Clara that he'd be honest with her about the challenges. The role would be demanding and the learning curve would be steep because she'd need to get up to speed on quantum dynamics specific systems and culture. Some people on his team might question her credentials or make assumptions about how she'd gotten the position. She would probably face skepticism and would have to prove herself more thoroughly than someone with a more traditional path. But if she was willing to deal with those challenges, he thought she could do extraordinary things at the company. Clara asked practical questions because that was how she'd learned to evaluate opportunities that sounded too good to be true. She asked about the timeline, about when he would need her to start and what the transition would look like. Marcus said they could be flexible, but ideally she'd give notice at her current position and start within 2 weeks. She asked about the team she'd be leading and what projects she'd be responsible for. Marcus pulled up an organizational chart and walked her through the structure, explaining that she'd be joining the AI research division as a technical director, overseeing a team of 12 engineers and researchers working on next-generation natural language processing and ethical AI frameworks. She asked about childcare and schedule flexibility, the question that had sunk so many previous opportunities. Marcus paused at that one, and Clara braced herself for the careful backpedaling she'd heard before. But instead, Marcus told her that Quantum Dynamics had on-site childcare for employees, something he'd implemented after his own divorce had made him acutely aware of how impossible parenting and career could be to balance. The center was open from 7 in the morning until 7 at night, and the company subsidized the cost. Additionally, the technical staff had flexible schedules as long as they hit their deadlines and attended critical meetings. He had engineers who worked from home 2 or 3 days a week, people who came in late and stayed late, people who front-loaded their hours into intense sprints and then took time off. What mattered was output and impact, not face time in the office. Every Answer Marcus gave dissolved another layer of Clara's skepticism, and she found herself moving from disbelief room erupted in immediate objections. The lawyers worried about liability exposure if they admitted fault. The PR team argued that putting an unknown technical director in front of cameras was too risky, compared to having Marcus deliver carefully managed statements. Some executives questioned whether being this transparent would cause more harm than good by drawing additional attention to the problem, but Marcus, who'd been silent through most of the debate, spoke up and said that Clara's approach was exactly right. He told the room that he'd built quantum dynamics by taking smart risks and being willing to operate differently than established competitors. The conventional playbook of deny, deflect, and delay might minimize short-term pain, but it would destroy long-term trust. If they wanted to be the company that led the AI industry toward more ethical practices, they had to be willing to go first, to be vulnerable, and to treat this crisis as an opportunity to demonstrate values through actions rather than press releases. He asked Clara if she was truly willing to take on this responsibility, and when she said yes, without hesitation, he told the rest of the team that they were moving forward with her plan. The next 2 weeks were the most intense of Clara's life since Mia's time in the NICU. She worked with engineers to conduct a rapid but thorough audit of the fraud detection system, documenting exactly where bias had been introduced through training data that reflected historical patterns of discrimination. She worked with her team to develop new evaluation metrics that measured fairness across multiple dimensions simultaneously, tools that could detect disparate impact even when overall accuracy appeared high. She prepared detailed technical explanations that were accurate but accessible to non-expert audiences. She did media training with the PR team, learning how to deliver key messages while handling hostile questions and not getting baited into defensive postures. And she coordinated with advocacy organizations who'd been criticizing the company, inviting them into dialogue about what accountability should actually look like and incorporating their feedback into the audit methodology. Throughout all of this, Clara was terrified she was making a massive mistake, that her inexperience would show, that she'd say something wrong in an interview that would become a viral clip used to mock both her and the company. But she also felt more alive and purposeful than ever, driven by the belief that this work actually mattered, that how they handled this crisis could influence how the entire tech industry thought about responsibility for algorithmic harm. The media strategy launched with a comprehensive blog post authored by Clara and published on the Quantum Dynamics website. The post was unlike anything a major tech company had published before, technically detailed, emotionally honest, and unflinching in acknowledging both what had gone wrong and what the company's responsibility was to fix it. Clara explained how machine learning systems trained on historical data could perpetuate historical biases, why standard accuracy metrics weren't sufficient for evaluating fairness, and what quantum dynamics was doing differently going forward. She included actual numbers showing the disparate impact, didn't hide behind jargon or euphemism, and took personal responsibility for the audit and remediation process. She announced that all the tools and methodologies they were developing would be released as open source, and she invited other companies and researchers to collaborate on improving them. She provided a timeline for when the fixes would be deployed and committed to publishing regular transparency reports showing their progress on fairness metrics across all AI systems. The post went viral immediately, shared tens of thousands of times and generating hundreds of articles analyzing quantum dynamics response. The reaction was mixed but trended far more positive than anyone had expected, with many commentators praising the company's transparency and willingness to take accountability seriously. Clara did a series of media interviews over the following days, appearing on tech podcasts, business news programs, and even a segment on a major network morning show. She was nervous before each appearance but found that once she started talking about the technical work, her passion and knowledge overcame the anxiety. She explained complex concepts clearly, never talked down to audiences, and refused to accept easy narratives that blamed either individual engineers or inevitable mathematical limitations. She framed algorithmic bias as a systems problem that required systems-level solutions, better data collection practices, more diverse teams, building the technology, mandatory fairness audits, and external oversight from affected communities. She spoke about her own experience being overlooked by the tech industry despite her qualifications, drawing connections between who gets to build AI systems and whose needs those systems prioritize. Some interviews were hostile, with reporters trying to trip her up or catch her contradicting previous statements, but Clara handled them by being consistently honest about what she knew, what she didn't know, and what quantum dynamics was committed to learning. By the end of the media cycle, Clara had become the face of ethical AI at quantum dynamics, and she'd earned respect from both advocates who'd been critics and industry peers who recognized she was operating at a level of technical and moral sophistication that raised the bar for everyone. The crisis response didn't just save quantum dynamics' reputation. It fundamentally changed the company's strategic direction and Clara's role within it. Marcus announced the creation of a new division focused exclusively on AI ethics and fairness, and he asked Clara to lead it in addition to her existing responsibilities. The new role came with a budget of $50 million, permission to hire a team of 30 people, and a mandate to audit all of quantum dynamic systems while also building tools and frameworks that other companies could use. Clara accepted the expanded role with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, knowing it meant even longer hours and higher stakes, but also believing it was the most important work she could possibly be doing. She threw herself into building the new division, recruiting researchers who specialized in fairness metrics and algorithmic auditing, hiring community liaisons who could ensure affected populations had voice in how systems were evaluated, and establishing partnerships with academic institutions and advocacy organizations. The work was exhausting but thrilling, combining cutting-edge technical challenges with real-world impact in ways that felt like finally fulfilling the promise she'd seen in her Berkeley research years ago. 6 months after the fraud detection crisis, Clara stood on stage at the world's largest AI conference, delivering a keynote address about algorithmic fairness to an audience of 3,000 researchers and practitioners. She'd been invited to speak because of the work quantum dynamics had done, but also because her personal story had resonated in an industry increasingly aware that it had a diversity problem. Clara looked out at the massive audience and felt surreal distance from the woman who'd been working security just a year earlier. She'd prepared extensively for this talk, workshop,